We're going to talk about network meta-analysis. Now, what I've been teaching you over the past week is part of a course that we often teach at the University of Glasgow. And normally we have a team of people teaching this course, and unfortunately for you, you only get to hear my voice for all this time. So this section normally is taught by my colleague Neil Hawkins, and so I just want to formally acknowledge Neil because most of these slides were made by Neil, and I've made some adjustments to slides to help me teach this session today. So I hope you already now have a sense of how broad this area is: systematic review, meta-analysis, and now network meta-analysis. Some people like myself have spent most of their career on this. There's still a lot of ongoing research and methodological development. What we've covered are the really basics of evidence synthesis, and it should give you a good grounding to build on, because if you do come across analysis that require reviews that require more complex methodology, then it's basically an extension of what we've talked about. So I know not many of you are going to be doing a network meta-analysis in your project, but I think it is an extremely important skill to be able to read a paper on network meta-analysis at minimum, at your level, when you have an MSc in HTA or PhD in HTA. Even if you're not going to do the analysis, you should be able to confidently read a paper on network meta-analysis, understand what the authors have done, and be able to critique this work. Because when you work in the position of HTA, when you have to evaluate evidence, this is potentially a very common piece of evidence you will get in your assessment. So that's why it's really important. So you also have been sent a paper from Dr. Uza for tomorrow's practical exercise. So it's a very similar approach to what I did with a previous exercise on critical appraisal. What I will ask you tomorrow is to try and critique this paper. Now, network meta-analysis is slightly more challenging than the pairwise meta-analysis. So I would like you to try and find time this afternoon or this evening to read that paper in a little bit more detail so that we can have a full discussion tomorrow. Now, I can give you a hint that the paper that I've given you has flaws in it, quite major flaws. So it's a challenge to you all to try and be good detectives and find this flaw. So hopefully after today, you will have all the tools that you need to try and identify the issues with that paper. Okay, so I'm going to start with basic principles and terminology relating to network meta-analysis. Now, I think it's important to really understand the different ways we're potentially comparing data. So in the top box here, we've got direct comparison. So you've got a head-to-head randomized control trial, for instance, comparing one thing with another, A versus B, for instance. So you've got a study, a randomized control trial, head-to-head comparison. Now, if you don't have head-to-head comparison, you may be comparing A and B through naive or unadjusted indirect comparisons. And that is when you use the treatment effect, you get an estimated treatment effect of A from one study, an estimated treatment effect of B from another study. So you're taking absolute effects from individual trials arms from different studies. This approach is an approach that is used long time ago, especially in economic evaluations when they're building models. They use different sources of data to inform the treatment effects of both arms. But this is really not the way to do things anymore. So this is the weakest approach, and this is really not recommended at all, to have a naive comparison of two interventions from different studies, from individual arms of different studies. So next we have adjusted indirect comparison. And this is when we're looking at relative effect estimates between treatments. But here we have direct comparison for A versus C and B versus C. So unlike a head-to-head trial, where A is compared to B in one study, so you're randomized to either A or B, here you have evidence that people are randomized to A and C, or another study, people randomized to B or C. So if you want to make a connection, if you want to understand the treatment effects between A and B in this situation, you need to use C as an anchor and calculate an adjusted indirect comparison. So this is what we mean when we talked about adjusted indirect comparison. And I'll go into a bit more detail later on how this is calculated. Now, beyond that, we have mixed treatment comparison or network meta-analysis. Now, this is when you have head-to-head comparison, randomized controlled trials of A versus B, similar to up here. But then you also have head-to-head comparison comparing A and C and B and C, similar to here. But you don't have a head-to-head trial randomizing the same group of patients to A, B, and C in the same study. So in a mixed treatment comparison or network meta-analysis, what we're doing is we're combining the direct head-to-head evidence with the adjusted indirect comparison. So we're using the totality of the evidence to try and estimate relative treatment effects between A, B, and C. So that is the difference between your direct comparison. So if you have lots of studies on the same direct comparison, you can do a meta-analysis like the way we've talked about it last week. And then if you don't, if you're interested more beyond A and B, or if you do not have studies directly comparing A and B together, but they are all compared to the same thing. So a very common comparator is placebo. Yeah, so there are different treatments for the same indication compared to placebo, but they're not compared to head study. So this is a very common situation, and basically you anchor it on the placebo and you calculate an adjusted indirect comparison by bringing these studies together. But the best approach really is a mixed treatment comparison where you can actually estimate the relative treatment effects between A, B, and C. Ideally, what you want is to run a randomized control trial where you will randomize patients into these three arms, A, B, or C. But these trials are very expensive to do, and companies who make drugs don't often like to do that. They want to compare it to the placebo. So this is why, given the evidence that we have, we really need to use what we have. So direct comparison and adjusted indirect comparison together, looking at the evidence together, will give us mixed treatment comparison. Okay, so it's really important to understand what we're doing. Is that clear for everybody? Now, so why are we talking about network meta-analysis today? So this is a really nice paper, and I've been saying to you, in HTA often we don't just get two options, we get more than two. And this is a good paper demonstrating that. It's a treatment for acute pyelonephritis in children. There are 18 trials testing 24 different regimens. And if you can look down this way are all the treatment regimens available. Across the way, you can see the number of trials being compared. So you can see most places, these trials are only compared with one comparator. So one, here Q, which is this one, is compared with this one H here. So there's no trials quite reasonably to say that comparing all these treatments at the same time. It's virtually impossible to do a head-to-head trial like this. So this is in reality, this is the evidence. You have one trial here comparing the last treatment with this treatment, and here you've got one trial comparing this treatment V over here with W, which is this treatment here. So this is a reality when you're looking at evidence. Yeah, so this is very common. So if you have to make a decision, if you have to talk about relative treatment effects across of these interventions, which one is the best? Which one's the most effective? Which one has the greatest efficacy? It's really difficult to tell based on this evidence. So what can we do when in that situation? One option is about lumping things together. So often people in this situation would think about grouping these together into smaller groups. So you might end up lumping them into two broad groups, and then it becomes a pairwise comparison. So that's what we mean by lumping. So often, if people think about treatment that has what they call a class effect, for instance, they might lump all the drugs together and call it a class effect, and they compare one class with another. But class effects are very difficult to determine, and it's not always true. When people say there is a class effect, it's not always true. There is a class effect, and they really need evidence to show that. So one option is about lumping things together. Now, the problem with lumping things together is if you compare one group with another, and you get a statistically significant difference between the two groups, what that is telling you is that there's one treatment in this group, at least one treatment in this group, that's different from at least one treatment in another group. So it still doesn't tell you about the individual differences between the individual drugs. So, and you don't really know which one is different from which one. Now, if you don't find a statistically significant difference between the groups, then again, it may mean that they are all different from each other, but it may mean that there are statistically significant differences that's masked by this lumping together. So the effect has been diluted because you've lumped it together. So if you lump it together and then try and do a pairwise meta-analysis, you lose a lot of information, and it's really difficult to understand what that results is telling you, even if you find a statistically significant difference. So let me show you an example here. So this is a Cochrane review looking at long-lasting beta-2 agonists compared with placebo, in addition to inhaled corticosteroids in children and adults with chronic asthma. So the analysis that they've done is they've lumped it together. So basically the long-acting beta agonists, the LABA, and the inhaled corticosteroids are lumped together. So all the LABA plus ICS in one arm and ICS alone in the other arm. So these are the individual studies, and it gives us a statistically significant reduction in exacerbation 0.7 with a confidence interval of 0.56 and 0.86. So this is considering all this, the LABAs all as a class. So it's really difficult to interpret this analysis because basically the null hypothesis relies on the assumption that all the LABAs are the same and all the ICS are the same. And we had a statistically significant finding in this analysis. And what this is telling us is at least one of the LABA in the individual trials that's been evaluated is better than at least one of the ICS. But we don't really know which one. So if the question is at least one LABA better than at least one ICS, then that analysis does answer your question, if this is a question. But the more useful question you want to ask is, are all the LABAs better than all the ICS? So that lumped analysis doesn't actually answer that. But better still, the question that you probably want to know, and your decision maker want to know, is which LABAs is the best and which ICS compared to ICS, and by how much? This is the question that we want to answer in health technology assessment. So lumping it together doesn't really help you get to that answer. Now, so lumping is not particularly great approach. What about splitting? So when the other option is we can look at the pairs separately. So this is I'll show you this with this example. This is a health technology assessment of early thrombolysis for the treatment of acute myocardial infarction, systematic review and economic evaluation. So in terms of studies, these are the studies that they found in the systematic reviews. So these are the sets of studies that compared alteplase with streptokinase, head-to-head comparison of these two drugs. There's one study comparing alteplase with tenecteplase, head-to-head comparison, two comparing alteplase and recteplase, and so on. So this is a dose-ranging and mixed regimen. So this is the entire evidence base that they have identified. So potentially, what you can do in this situation is you can pull all this data together in a meta-analysis, pairwise meta-analysis in the manner that we talked about last week. You can pull these two together. There are only one study in these comparisons, so there is no need for a meta-analysis. So, in fact, this is what they've done. So this is for the outcome mortality up to 35 days. And the top set is the meta-analysis of the studies comparing alteplase with streptokinase. So every trial gives you an estimate, and you can calculate a pooled estimate for this comparison. Similarly, for this comparison, there were two studies, so you can do the same. And then you can test for heterogeneity, do everything that we talked about last week. And then with a single study, basically, you're relying on the results from the individual studies. So this is splitting the data. Now, splitting the data is even more interesting because this is part of the summary. Now, let me read this to you. So they said, definitive conclusions on efficacy are that streptokinase is as effective as accelerated alteplase. So this is based on one of the pairs. And tenecteplase is as effective as accelerated alteplase, so that based on another pairwise comparison. And that recteplase is at least as effective as streptokinase. Some conclusions require interpretation of data, i.e. whether streptokinase is as effective as or inferior to accelerated alteplase, or whether recteplase is as effective as accelerated alteplase or not. So if you're a decision maker, based on this, what are you going to do? One is better than the other is as good as that, and then the third one might be as good as the first one. So this is if you're handed this conclusion, how are you going to so splitting is problematic as well. So pairwise meta-analysis have a number of limitations. So as I've shown you, technologies that we're interested in may not always be compared in head-to-head studies. Even when head-to-head studies exist, additional indirect evidence may be relevant. So it's about looking at the totality of the evidence. And decisions often on technologies are based on more than two comparisons. So as I've shown you just before, that pairwise meta-analysis can be really difficult to interpret. The comparisons may not be consistent with each other. So for instance, when you have something like this, it is really difficult also to summarize uncertainty. So if you think about, we talked about calculating variance, building confidence intervals around these estimates, again, it's going to be really, it's really difficult to summarize the uncertainty in your evidence if you've got lots of pairs that don't actually relate, that it's really difficult to relate to each other. And analysis where treatments are lumped together can also be ambiguous. So, so this is why mixed treatment comparison or network meta-analysis, which is basically talking about the same thing, is a really important tool. Because otherwise, you're restricting yourself to either lumping or splitting data. Yes, you can do an accurate analysis, but what do those results tell you? And how can you use those results is questionable. So network meta-analysis is a good option or good solution to this problem. The important point here is network meta-analysis is not a separate methodology from what we've been talking about. It's not something completely remote. It's an extension to what we've been talking about. We talk about direct comparisons, A versus B. When we have more than one randomized control trials comparing the same thing, we can pull them together, calculating a weighted average. And in indirect comparison, simply what we're doing is comparing it. We don't have any direct evidence comparing A and B. But in this case, we have direct evidence comparing A and C. We may have more than one trial doing this. So here, you have a pairwise meta-analysis potentially. And similarly, you may have studies comparing B and C. You may have more than one. Again, this could be from pairwise meta-analysis. And from this, based on these evidence, you then estimate the indirect comparison between these two. So it is really just the next step from the direct comparison. So this is a really, really nice introductory paper to network meta-analysis, and it basically uses the example of thrombolysis that I've shown you earlier with the splitting data to show you the value of network meta-analysis. This published in the British Medical Journal in 2005. So for those who have no experience in network meta-analysis, this is a paper that I definitely recommend. They describe the whole process in very, very user-friendly terms. So what they've done is they look at the totality of evidence, which is what we need to do in meta-analysis. So if you think about the potential treatment options we talked about earlier, so we've got rect place, accelerated rect outer place, tenected place, and so on. So these are the treatment options. And what we do is we draw a network based on our evidence. So this is what my slides are way ahead of me today. So I must have put a timer on it. So here, basically what this is saying is there was one trial comparing accelerated outer place and tenected place. And there's another trial that compared accelerated outer place to rected place. So there's a line between these two, and a number indicating the number of trials available. There's a large number of trials comparing accelerated outer place and PTCA across the way. There are 11 trials doing that. So this is a network. This is your network of evidence. Now this is a particular shape. Different evidence that you're looking at will have different shapes. So drawing the network is really, really important. That's the first thing you should always do when you're considering a network meta-analysis. All the papers that you have there, can you draw a network? Can you link them all together through this network of evidence? And so this is a really important first step. Now, a network meta-analysis is actually based on the pairwise comparison. So for the 35-day mortality odds ratio, this is the evidence that you get from your network of evidence. So you've got all these studies compared to streptokinase giving you these pairwise odds ratios. So some of them may be from more than one study from pooled meta-analysis. Some of them are based on one trial. If you remember, there's a mixed number of studies. There's only one study comparing PTCA and outer place, and then these studies comparing with accelerated outer place. So you can map your evidence in a table like this, which is quite helpful. So you can see where you have data and where you don't have data from head-to-head evidence. And then the calculations in the network meta-analysis allows you to calculate a relative treatment effect relative to a common comparator. And here they picked outer place as a common comparator. So all these treatment effects are compared with outer place. So it gives you an indirect comparison with the outer place. So you can then make comparisons across the way. So here, if you remember PTCA compared with outer place, there were quite a number of studies. So we have direct comparison as well. So there were head-to-head studies. So the direct comparison with the head-to-head study gives us an odds ratio of 0.63. But the network meta-analysis gave us an odds ratio of 0.65. So this value basically takes into account the head-to-head direct evidence and the indirect evidence, whereas this is just from the direct evidence. And it's really useful to make comparisons between these two, because it gives you an indication of consistency between your direct and indirect evidence. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So this is the kind of output you'll get from a network meta-analysis. And then finally, the next thing you can calculate is probability best, which is really, really helpful. So out of all these options in your network, which one has the highest probability of being the most effective treatment for this particular outcome? So 35-day mortality, and the network meta-analysis results show that PTCA has the highest probability of being the most effective treatment. and then the rest, the probability of them, any of them being better, the best option out of all this is very low, 0, and this is just slightly above 0. And you can do this for fixed and random effects model in a network meta-analysis as well. So it gives you ranking, which is also quite useful in HEHTA decision making. So network meta-analysis can provide an easy way to interpret estimates of comparative effects when you have more than 2 treatment comparisons based on the available evidence. It also provides you a summary of uncertainty. So again, you can calculate variance and confidence intervals around your estimates from your network meta-analysis. It can provide estimates of relative effectiveness where trials directly comparing the treatments do not exist. So you do not need the existence of head-to-head comparisons for that. And also, so it also takes into account indirect evidence, and it only works if you have a connected network. So if your trials don't connect with each other, if you end up having 1 or 2 trials that don't relate to the rest of them because your evidence don't connect, then it won't work. So a network meta-analysis can only work if you have a network that connects all the studies together. So there's a common comparator that links different things. There may be more than one common comparator, as I've shown you in my previous network. So let's look a bit closely at how we do this. So this is about adjusted indirect comparison, which is what network meta-analysis is building upon. So this is our network of trials, as I've shown you earlier. And I'm just going to look at this particular connection. So here we have 8 studies that compared alteplase with streptokinase, and then 8 studies comparing PTCA with streptokinase. So streptokinase here is the common comparator, is the anchor. And through these studies and these studies, you can actually calculate an adjusted indirect comparison between these two. So I think there were direct evidence anyway, but in the absence of direct evidence, or in the presence of direct evidence, you can still calculate an indirect comparison between these two. So how do we calculate this? So direct estimates from the 8 trials, the pooled meta-analysis looking at this pair, gives us an odds ratio of 0.89 and a confidence interval of 0.54 to 1.14. Now this is calculated based on the pairwise meta-analysis like we talked about last week. So you already know how to do this, comparing alteplase with streptokinase. Same comparison, 8 studies, and you get this. Similarly here, 8 studies compared PTCA with streptokinase. You pull it all together, and this is the weighted average. So you already know the effect here and the effect here based on direct evidence. And what you're trying to calculate is alteplase and PTCA relationship. So what you do for an adjusted indirect comparison is what you're calculating is actually the relative effects between those two. So to compare the relationship, the odds ratio of PTCA relative to alteplase is basically the treatment effect of PTCA compared to streptokinase, which is this arm here, relative to the odds ratio of alteplase versus streptokinase, which is this arm here. So the odds ratio is basically 0.49 divided by 0.89, which gives us a relative treatment effect of 0.55. It's very straightforward in an adjusted indirect comparison. And we do that because we assume consistency across the trials. And so only if this assumption is fulfilled can you use this calculation. So basically, the assumption of consistency is that the treatment effect of A and B is equal to the treatment effect of A and C minus the treatment effect of B and C, depending on the scale that you're using. So this is on the odds ratio scale. If you take the log of the odds ratio, then this becomes a subtraction. The ratio becomes a subtraction. And so this is the assumption of consistency. So basically, it's assuming that these studies are all consistent. They're all being measuring the same thing. And what you're, the common comparator here is C. So when you're comparing A and C, that C is the same as the C when you're comparing B and C from the two trials. So that's really important. And it's very, very similar to what we talk about in pairwise meta-analysis. You can calculate uncertainty around your effect estimates. So the variance of the log odds ratio is basically the sum of the variance of the log odds ratio of the individual treatment comparisons that contribute to your calculation here. And the standard deviation is basically the square root of your variance. Now, you can do this because we're assuming that they are independent of each other. And that's true because these information came from different studies. So they can be considered as independent random variables. And so, again, a very straightforward calculation. So the variance of log odds ratio relative to B and C is based on the pairwise comparison. So you already know how to calculate this set. You already know how to calculate this from the pairwise meta-analysis we talked about last week. And so combining it together will give you the variance for your adjusted indirect comparison. Yeah? Are you still with me? Good. Okay, so once you're able to calculate the variance and the standard deviation, then again, similar to last week, you calculate a confidence interval. So here, for this estimate, we can calculate the confidence interval for the odds for the treatment effect, PTCA relative to alteplase, and here's 0.24 to 1.29. And it's, again, based on what we talked about last week, we're working on the log scale, so assumes a normal distribution using the formula for calculating 95% confidence interval, and this is what we get. So this is why we emphasize that this is an extension to pairwise meta-analysis. It's a further step from what you did last week. Now, it's important to remember the uncertainty that we calculate in indirect estimates. The confidence interval are estimated by adding the variance that contribute to this indirect comparison. But it only represents the uncertainty from the sampling error in the contributing trials. It does not represent uncertainty in the fundamental assumptions, so we talk about consistency. So if there are heterogeneity, especially if there are potential effect modifiers, then the variance doesn't capture that, so which is very similar to pairwise meta-analysis. And so what we talk about is the best case estimate of uncertainty, the uncertainty that we present. Because it's the minimum amount of variation that we've built in the estimate. So in reality, if you take into account potential inconsistency or heterogeneity, then the uncertainty should be greater than what the calculation is giving you. And so, taking the adjusted indirect comparison to the next level, to network meta-analysis, because if you remember the network that you've built, potentially you've got lots of these little triangles here that you can draw from. And what you're doing is in the network meta-analysis is you're estimating all this simultaneously. So it's like trying to work on simultaneous equation solving when they're all related to each other. So the extension of basic indirect comparison to a more complex network, you estimate a treatment effect that best fit the network of trial comparisons. So you're estimating all these at the same time. You're not just looking at individual parts of the network and working them one at a time. And they're all related to each other. So this is a simultaneous set of equations that you're trying to solve in a sense. So And so what you're trying to estimate is here, the example that I gave earlier, the beta alteplase is basically the treatment effect of alteplase relative to the common comparator streptokinase, beta rectiplase, PTCA. So these are basically all your odds ratios within the network that you're trying to calculate. And for beta alteplase is a log odds ratio of alteplase versus streptokinase. Because if you remember the network, the beta alteplase is a log odds ratio of rectiplase versus streptokinase. And then for beta alteplase minus the PTCA will give you the indirect comparison. So these are all the things that you're trying to estimate at the same time within your network. And there are different approaches to doing these calculations. Right, so I'm just going to show you this in a bit more detail to just make sure that it's clear. So you have an adjusted indirect comparison here. You've got evidence here, evidence here, and you're trying to estimate this. But what can happen in a more complex network is this could be your network. So you also have trials comparing A and D and B and D. So you can estimate this effect through this relationship as well as this relationship. And this is what I mean by you're estimating all these at the same time. So the network can continue to grow. So here it might have another relationship, or there may be another common comparator that you can use for A and B to look at that indirect comparison. And then in addition to that, you may actually have direct evidence comparing A and B as well. And then what you can then do is to combine these together, the indirect estimate and the direct estimates combined together. But what you're doing in network meta-analysis, all this is being estimated at the same time. So essentially, this is what we're doing. So the common approaches to estimating network meta-analysis, maximum likelihood estimation, or the Bayesian Monte Carlo Markov chain methods. I am not going to go into detail today on either of these methods, but what I can tell you is if you're using Stata, you're most likely going through this approach. Now, I don't actually use Stata, I use Winbug, so I normally use a Bayesian approach for my network meta-analysis. And you should get very similar estimates between the two approaches. It's just the way that these estimates are, these simultaneous estimation are done. It's just a slightly different approach. So maximum likelihood estimation can be done in Stata. It does not require priors. So a Bayesian analysis requires you to have a prior before your analysis, and it is a different way of thinking about statistics. The maximum likelihood estimation is a more familiar approach, and it has a frequentist interpretation. And it's relatively straightforward to implement in Stata. For those of you who've run a network meta-analysis will know that. Bayesian Markov chain Monte Carlo methods is implemented in Winbugs. It's not a particularly user-friendly software. Those of you who've ever seen Winbugs will probably open it, look at it, and think, not for me. And I must say, my initial reaction was that as well. But for more complex structures, more complex networks and models, Winbugs is a lot more flexible. So network meta-analysis potentially can be a multi-level analysis. So for those kind of models, it is easier to implement in Winbugs. And it also allows direct estimates about parameter uncertainty in Winbugs. It's based on a simulation method, so the Bayesian approach, and it facilitates a decision analytical approach. So it's the Winbugs MCMC is not so far off from what you're doing when you're carrying out a probabilistic sensitivity analysis. So you're basically resampling from distribution. So I can point you to the papers if you're really interested in mechanics, but I'm not really going to cover that today. So we've got now comparisons, estimates from different comparisons for PTCA and alteplase in our example. So the direct evidence, the head-to-head randomized control trials, gave us an estimate of 0.63 with a confidence interval of 0.25 to 1.29. So there is a benefit, there's a risk reduction, but it's not statistically significant because the confidence interval includes 1 for the odds ratio. The indirect estimates, based on adjusted indirect comparison that we talked about, gave us an estimate of 0.55, again, a risk reduction, but similarly, a very close, similar confidence interval to the direct evidence, and not statistically non-significant finding. Now, the network meta-analysis gives us a risk reduction, but this time it reports a statistically significant effect. So, which one do you trust? You know what I'm going to do next? You're laughing. Of course, I'm going to ask you to make decisions. So, let's do a vote. Okay, so today is the last teaching day. So please don't sit on the fence. Be brave. Make a decision. So expect everybody to put your hand up at least once. Right. Who would say, I'm only going to trust the direct evidence? Okay? Okay, right. 6 of you. Who's going to trust the indirect evidence? Nobody. Nobody. I showed you the mathematics. It's very reliable. No? What about the network meta-analysis estimate? Who's going to trust that? Most of you. Okay, so... Right, so why? So for those of you who only trust direct evidence, why? Why do you think this is the most reliable estimate or most accurate estimate of the real effect? Vivani, you're one of the people.
It actually directly compares. Logically, yes, it is compared between both of them. So it is expected that will give the best or most reliable thing. So because it is head-to-head.
Okay, because they're head-to-head and there are real data, you can observe it. Yeah, is that what you're saying? Okay. Okay, so nobody had to defend this. So what about network meta-analysis? Who would like to try and defend network meta-analysis? Why is that?
It's a very small, narrow, confidence interval and precise estimates.
Okay, so it is a narrow confidence interval. Why do you think this confidence interval is narrower than the others?
Because most studies are. Because that network meta-analysis has been prepared, use various different kind of studies in various settings also. So it has used a...
It's the same studies. They are all done by the same studies. It's the same set of trials. This is only looking at the direct evidence. This is only looking at the indirect evidence. This is looking at them together. It's how you calculate it. Same studies. You're not excluding anyone. They all consider the same set of studies. Who else put their hand up for network meta-analysis? Who else wants to try and defend? Go on.
I think because network is combine the result from direct and indirect. It means that you combine everything that can possible from the more sample size, so it's made precise.
Okay, so I think you're almost there with the explanation. So for this scenario, my personal view is I would use the results from the network meta-analysis. Now that is because of certain condition. First of all, the network meta-analysis looks at the totality of the evidence, beyond the direct evidence, because to look at indirect evidence, you're drawing strength from other comparisons as well. So that's why, as a result, you have a narrower confidence interval, because more information has gone into it. Not more studies, it's the same number of studies. There's more information informing this. This is the totality of the evidence. Now, but I would only believe this is robust when you compare the direct, indirect, and network meta-analysis evidence, that there's relative consistency across them. So if the direct and indirect evidence, in particular, are very, very different, it suggests that the studies are not consistent, then I would probably not go with the network meta-analysis estimate. But in this case, they are consistent, suggesting that these trials, the assumption of consistency is right, and you can then use, so this estimate that we use adjusted indirect comparison to estimate is reliable, and hence the network meta-analysis will give us more power because it's drawing strength from the non-head-to-head studies as well. So in a sense, yes, I think, if you want to think about the number of studies, in a way, yes, in the network meta-analysis, you do have more studies than the direct evidence. But it's better to think about the not just by the number of studies, but looking at the totality of the evidence and drawing strength across the network. Okay. So reasons for preferring direct evidence, because it's believed to be less biased than indirect evidence. It may be true in some cases, but not always, because direct evidence can be biased as well, depending on how the study is performed. So it's very context specific. You need to look at your studies. The use of indirect evidence may inhibit the conduct of future trials. So that's one danger that people think, well, if we're all relying on network meta-analysis and indirect comparison, then nobody would be interested in doing head-to-head studies. But I don't think that's necessarily true, because there are limitations to these studies, and for these studies to make sense, you have to be able to build a connected network. They need to be consistent. You need to have data, and so I don't think you can assume that because we have this methodology, people will stop doing randomized control trial. It's the same argument people use for observational study, because the analytical technique has improved so much over the years that people are now using observational studies to try and estimate treatment effect, where in the past we only used randomized control trials. But there are still limitations to those methods, so it will never really replace the value, the need for randomized control trials. Motivation for using indirect comparisons. So when there are no trial data exist, do you just simply turn around and say, we cannot make any comparisons, so we won't make a decision? Or do you try and use indirect comparisons? Estimates from a combination of direct and indirect evidence may be more precise, as we can see, because you're drawing strength, more informative, drawing strength from other studies, and so it's more informative. Indirect evidence may be believed to be less biased. So again, it really depends on the data that you have in your analysis. Estimates from a combination of direct and indirect evidence may be more accurate, may more accurately affect uncertainty. So again, if you look at direct and indirect evidence together, you're looking. If you look beyond direct evidence, you may have more accurate estimate of the uncertainty around your estimates, rather than underestimating the uncertainty. Incoherence between direct and indirect evidence may actually be informative. So again, it's about thinking about heterogeneity, like we said last week. If it's inconsistent, if your direct and indirect evidence is inconsistent, it's about exploring it, trying to understand why it's inconsistent, rather than just throw out your analysis and say, we just can't use it. So you might want to adjust for heterogeneity between trials. There may be effect modifiers that is worth looking at. And also, the scale that you use for the analysis is also important. So whether you choose to analyze your data on an odds ratio scale, relative risk scale, or risk difference scale may have an impact on the consistency of your results. So which approach should we favor? Direct comparisons ideal when there are direct data, but it ignores the indirect evidence, so it's not always going to be the best approach. It's routinely available, easily to implement, and it has high internal validity because you're quite restricted in terms of what you're including. Adjusted indirect comparison can be used when there are no direct evidence, and it can be limited to comparing based on a single common comparator, because you need an anchor for your adjusted indirect comparison. It's relatively simple to calculate, and it's easier to understand the implications of heterogeneity in the set of trials for adjusted indirect comparison. For network meta-analysis, is adjusted for network meta-analysis, is used when adjusted indirect comparison is not possible on its own. It can be used to analyze any networks, and it uses all available evidence. But the key is the network. It's got to be connected. But it requires quite complex analysis, and it could be difficult to understand the implications of heterogeneity. When you see inconsistency and heterogeneity in a network, it's quite difficult to understand. It could be quite extensive because you're bringing so much information together. So that's the trade-off for network meta-analysis. So again, we're doing meta-analysis. We need to think about potential heterogeneity. So we talk about consistency. Where does this assumption of consistency come from? So if you think about a single trial, 3-arm head-to-head trial, you've got people randomized to A, B, or C, 3 treatments. And each group reports a response rate. So in arm A, there's 30% response, 20% in B, and 10% in C, suggesting that A, out of 3, A is the best relative to B, relative to C. Yeah? So this is if you have a 3-arm trial. So by the definition of consistency, calculate the relative risk of these treatments in your head-to-head trial, you can calculate relative risk of A and B, which gives you 1.5, relative risk of B and C, which gives you 2, relative risk of A and C, which gives you 3. Yeah, very straightforward calculation. It's a ratio of probabilities of the events in each of the comparison. So if you're looking at relative effects of A and B, it's the same as the ratio of the relative effects of A and C relative to B and C, which is basically a consistency assumption. So in the 3-arm trial, you can see that it's consistent. Also on the odds scale, so you can also calculate odds ratio from these comparisons. So the odds of A relative to B is 1.71, and then 2.25 and 3.86. And so on the odds ratio scale, based on the assumption of consistency, the relative effect of A and B is equals to the ratio of A versus C relative to B versus C. And if you calculate it, it will give you 1.71, which is the same as the direct evidence that you've seen here. Okay. Now, on the risk difference scale, comparing A and B, you get 10% gain. Comparing B to C, again 20% compared to 10, you get 10% gain. Comparing A and C, 30% and 10%, you get 20% gain in this 3-arm trial if you're calculating a risk difference. And so on the risk difference scale, instead of calculating a ratio, you're subtracting. So A versus B becomes 20% here, A versus C, relative minus the relationship here. So it gives you a gain of 10%, which is the same here. Yeah. So the 3 scales, they actually you can calculate this on any scale. Now, the potential problem arises. So if you have a completely homogeneous set of trials, so if these are separate trials, this is one trial, this is one trial, this is one trial, and you're bringing them together, then if it's consistent, it should behave like a 3-arm trial, a head-to-head 3-arm trial. Yeah. So again, here the relative risk here over the relative risk here gives you 1.5. So this is inconsistent if the trials are consistent. So if all these trials are looking at severe patients, there are no heterogeneity across these trials, then the assumption of consistency should hold. Now, in a heterogeneous set of trial, they will still be consistent if the differences are in terms of prognostic factors and not effect modifiers. So if mild patients and severe patients are, whether the severity of disease are prognostic, then it should still be consistent. So you here have a set of trials comparing A and C in mildly affected patients, and here you've got the comparison between severe patients, and here you've also got a set of trials on severe patients. Now, if mild patients are prognostic, so it shouldn't have a systematic impact on your estimate effect, then you should still get this consistency. You should still have this same estimate here. But if the severity of disease are predictive, so if mild patients actually has a lower risk, then potentially you're bringing in heterogeneity and it will give you inconsistent results. So here, in this set of trials, A compared to C may give you a different relative risk to severe patients because the severity of the disease has a systematic impact on your treatment effect. Then, if you take the relative effect between these two, it will be 0.75, and that should be not equals to 1.5. So this is when your set of trials are not consistent. Okay? So a heterogeneous set of trials may be consistent on one effect scale, so for the relative risk scale. So it is also possible that you have heterogeneity, you have a heterogeneous set of trials, but it will still give you consistent treatment effect on the relative scale in this example. But if you look at it at a risk difference scale, it might not give you the same. So the treatment effect here in the bubbles are the same, 60% and 20%, 20% and 10%, 90% and 20%, and this is on the relative risk scale. But if you look at it in the risk difference scale, the adjusted comparison is basically 40% here minus the 10%, which gives you 30%, which is not equals to the 10% that's observed in this set of trials. So the scale that you use in your calculation may have an impact on the measure of consistency. So in network meta-analysis, it's quite good to actually test that assumption, if possible. So consistency is an assumption. So it's not a natural law. You're making that assumption when you're carrying out your analysis. And as I've shown you, it can be dependent on the choice of scale, whether you use relative risk odds ratio or risk difference. And you always have to remember that the analysis that you're doing is based on the model, and it doesn't. It's a model, it's an estimate, and as George Box, famous statistician, says, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think it's a very important quote to remember. And consistency will be confounded by material difference in the distribution of predictive factors between sets of trials making different comparisons. So before you even actually think about the analysis, similar to what we talked about last week, have a good understanding of your data sources. How similar are they? What are the potential differences? Are there potential effect modifiers that will have an impact on your estimates and on your assumptions, on your model assumptions? So here's roughly a 3-step plan for evaluating the impact of heterogeneity. So step 1 is to assess the extent of the heterogeneity. You can do that by reviewing your evidence table, look at the different study design, how the studies are conducted, are there different subject characteristics, and you can then assess the observed characteristics. So if you can see potential differences, and then you can actually make adjustment and make assessment. Then the next step is assessing the impact. Does the heterogeneity in your data has an impact to your overall estimates? How important is it? So you can look at subgroup analysis and regression, similar to what we talked about last time. And you can do inconsistency analysis in network meta-analysis, which also reflects the unobserved characteristics. So subgroup and regression, you're looking at observed characteristics. You need to have data to look at these differences. But to look at inconsistency, you're observing, you're reflecting unobserved characteristics. And then you try and account for the effects of potential heterogeneity through regression, stratification, matching, or using a different scale to analyze your data and to adjust for the observed characteristics. So these are the steps that you can use to look and to analyze and deal with your heterogeneity. And again, it's just building on what we talked about in pairwise meta-analysis. So inconsistency, so there's two sets of data we looked at earlier, the direct and the indirect comparison. So the assumption is for the indirect comparison is based on assumption of consistency, so that we allow this calculation so are the data consistent with the assumption? So we can look at, what we can look at is the difference in log odds ratio. So the log odds ratio for indirect evidence is minus 0.53, and for direct is minus 0.46, and you can look at the difference between these two and calculate the confidence interval and the p-value. So potentially you can formally test it. And this is basically telling us there are no difference between the two log odds here. And the way your network look is really important, because you can only test for consistency if your network is of that shape. So for a network of this shape, which represents a network of second-generation anti-epileptic drug in epilepsy, you cannot observe inconsistency because you don't have a closed loop. This is a star-shaped network, because remember, you're comparing direct with indirect evidence. But for a network like this, for antihypertensive therapy, there are potentially lots of loops within the network, so you can then test for consistency. So again, these are the limitations. It really depends on the shape of your network. And the shape of the network depends on the data that you have. So you can't really control it. So to allow for heterogeneity, we can use random effects model, network meta-analysis. Like pairwise meta-analysis, you can run fixed and random effects model based on the underlying hypothesis that we talked about last week. But remember, random effects model only allows for inconsistency between direct and indirect estimates if the loops exist in the network. And it combines variation between trials within a comparison and inconsistency between direct and indirect estimates in a single variance estimate. And it generally assumes common variance for all treatment. So like the random effects model in pairwise meta-analysis, if there are underlying effect modifiers that affect your heterogeneity, the model doesn't correct for that. So you can't just lump very different studies together, run a random effects model and say, that's fine because I have used a random effects model. So it doesn't address for systematic difference in heterogeneity. You really need to go down the route of subgroup analysis or regression to deal with that. So it's the same for network meta-analysis. That's just random effects model. So adjusting for heterogeneity, you can use stratification or regression techniques. So that's basically like subgroup analysis. So stratification, between trial variation, only approach for design issue. So similar trials. But the thing is, if you stratify, you're reducing the sample size. So you're reducing usable data. You can use meta-regression, but meta-regression requires power, large number of studies, and typically the meta-regression that we do in meta-analysis lack power because there are not enough information. So for within-trial variation, we can also use subgroup analysis, again for stratification, and for within-trial variation, regression. For regression methods, adjust based on within-trial regression to obtain comparable estimates. But for this, one option is really to go and seek individual patient data for, at the regression level, because it's basically similar to pairwise meta-analysis. Based on reported results, it's very limited, depending on what data you have from the studies that will allow you to do that. So we can adjust for between trial variation and within trial variation using either stratification or regression techniques. So let me show you an example about the impact of heterogeneity. So this is an example on stroke prevention, insight from incoherence. And this is a quote from this trial, the Prof trial published in New England Journal of Medicine. And it says that if clinical trials were sporting contests, then it would be fair to say that low-dose aspirin plus extended release of okay, so you guys are better than I am at least. So Acknowledgements was the clear favorite against clopidogrel going into the Prof trial. So prior to doing the trial, the underlying hypothesis is that Acknowledgements will perform much better against clopidogrel. And the reason that they came to that statement was because at that stage, there were only 3 randomized controlled trials. So 2 trials looked at this comparison, aspirin plus ERDP relative to aspirin, and which is this. So 2 studies gave us a pooled effect of 0.79 with a confidence interval of 0.67 to 0.92, statistically significant risk reduction. And here, the Capri trial compared aspirin with clopidogrel. So this is how you read this kind of diagram. Sometimes you see it in network meta-analysis. One trial comparing these comparator, one trial comparing these 2, this trial comparing this one and this one. So, so there are only one trial, the Capri trial. So this is the Capri trial comparing aspirin with clopidogrel, and it gave you a statistically non-significant finding. And essentially, based on naive comparison, that this is a statistically significant risk reduction. This is suggesting there's almost no difference between the 2. So prior to the trial, they think that, well, if we compare this to aspirin, then this is going to be a sure winner. So that was the hypothesis. But if you actually look into the data, you know that beforehand, the optimism is a bit unwarranted, because if you look at the indirect comparison based on this, so if you actually calculate an indirect comparison here, then it will give you an odds ratio of 0.85 with a confidence interval of 0.66 to 1.06, a statistically non-significant finding. Indeed, the Prof trial at the end reported an odds ratio of 1.02 with a confidence interval of 0.03 to 1.11. So the new trial, the Prof trial, actually is in agreement with the indirect comparison. So the author says, how do we interpret the null results of the Prof trial in light of the previous evidence showing clear superiority for low-dose aspirin plus extended release as compared with aspirin? So so the author was a bit surprised because the underlying hypothesis was based on naive comparison. Now, so what the author's then question is whether the assumption of transitivity was valid at all, because that indirect comparison of the existing trials was based on the assumption of transitivity. So these quotes from the paper basically reflect their questioning of the assumption. Were there effect modifiers in the data set that could have explained the results? So looking closer at the evidence, we actually found out that there are different dosages of aspirin being looked at within these studies. So what previously was done was it was all lumped together as aspirin. But there are high dose, low dose, and medium dose aspirin. So the match trial compared aspirin and clopidogrel with clopidogrel. So the trial itself doesn't split the doses up. But here you've got the ATC 2002, a 3-arm trial comparing high, low, and medium dose. And then you've got Capri trial, which is actually high dose compared with clopidogrel. And the Commersant trial, that's comparing aspirin and clopidogrel with aspirin medium dose. So that's a potential effect modifier. So if we actually look at the network and taking into consideration the dosages of the aspirin being compared, this is the network you can draw based on the trials, based on that diagram that I've shown you. And here are the relationships, the direct estimates that the trials reported. So this is actually telling us that indirect evidence is not statistically significant. Direct evidence of the professed trial is not statistically significant. And when you combine it all together, it's also statistically not significant. And that's partly because it masks the dosing effect. It's in the different dosages. Have I got another slide? So in the different dosages. Whereas if you look at the wider network, and drawing evidence from more trials, because as you can see, this network drawing more trials than the previous. Previous, we only had 3 trials. We only looked at the ESPS2, Esprit, and Capri in the previous graph, previous slide. But this looks at a broader network. So basically, what this has done is to broaden the network and bring in the different dosages so drawing more information from the analysis. And so comparing these two, we've got direct, indirect, and combined evidence confirming there's no difference between the two. So ultimately, this is actually saying that it is relatively consistent, the findings. So the authors were questioning whether the consistency assumption is valid. And ultimately, what you need to remember is it requires judgment. You as a reviewer, an assessor, HTA, need to make that judgment on whether whether your network is consistent or not consistent. The credibility of network meta-analysis can be weakened by known differences between the trial that might act as treatment effect modifiers. So we've covered that. It can be strengthened by consistency between direct and indirect evidence. It can give you confidence that your results are robust if the loops exist and if you can demonstrate that. And it can be strengthened by analysis that adjusts or account for observed treatment effect modifiers and consistency. So you can carry out regression analysis. You can adjust for them within your network meta-analysis to give you more robust results. Okay, so I'm going to move on to how you present your results for network meta-analysis. Do you have any questions at this stage? Okay, so in network meta-analysis, network diagram, really important. Do they include loops? You need to present them very clearly. So the potential comparators, the direct evidence, and the estimated effect from the direct evidence. It could be from one study, it could be from multiple studies. So this is an example of docetaxel, placebo, gabapentin. I can't remember what this was for. Is it for lung cancer? I think it's for lung cancer. Now, so the other thing to remember is these estimates in network meta-analysis are related to each other, especially when you have loops. So there's correlation between these estimates that you're estimating. So this is a correlation plot that looks at the correlation between the estimate from, for instance, docetaxel and placebo and erlotinib and placebo. So this is looking at correlation. There's clearly a stronger correlation between the estimates of docetaxel versus placebo relative to gabapentin and placebo here. So a correlation plot is very useful in network meta-analysis because the estimates that you're estimating simultaneously are all related to each other within the network. And you can also produce a forest plot similar to pairwise meta-analysis. And this forest plot basically is anchored on placebo. So this is a common, not necessarily anchored because it could be network, it's a network meta-analysis. So this is a common comparator. So these relative effects that is being reported is relative to the placebo. So, but you cannot compare the confidence intervals across these estimates because, again, potential correlation, because they're all related to each other. So what's really useful is you can then calculate ranking for these comparisons. So ranking here from 1 to 5, 1 is the most effective, 5 is the least effective. And each treatment is listed down this way. So the easiest thing to look at, for instance, placebo, the probability of placebo being the best out of all this is 0. The probability of placebo being second best out of all these treatments, again, is 0. The probability of placebo being the worst is very high out of all this, which is what you would expect. So this circle is proportional to the probability. So in these graph outputs, you often see that you get quite, so 0.91, almost close to 100% certainty, you've got the biggest circle. Now for this treatment, erlotinib, it's got the highest probability of being ranked the most effective, 0.85. And the probability of this being the second most effective out of all this is 0.1, and then third most effective, fourth most effective, fifth most effective is pretty similar. In fact, this is telling us that it's very unlikely that erlotinib is not the most effective out of all this. So this is how you read the probability ranking. So in terms of presenting your network, this is a network looking at antidepressants. So this is a relatively complex network, and it's not entirely unusual. So these are all the comparators available. And here, this one, fluoxetine, has the largest circle here because it's being compared to the most. And here, this treatment has a tiny dot, which means that it's not very common that this is being compared in a study. And the lines are the direct evidence between the studies. Now this line is particularly thick. It means that there's a large number of studies comparing this comparison. So this is how you read a network diagram. The other results that are useful in the network meta-analysis is a step-ladder diagram. And it gives you basically all the comparisons between the pairs. So this diagonal are all your treatment comparisons. So you've got about 12 of them. And so these are for 2 different outcomes. So here, down this way is the response rate. This is one outcome. The second outcome up here is acceptability. So this diagram is able to show the results of 2 outcomes. Because in meta-analysis, you don't always just look at a single outcome. You might be extracting data from multiple outcomes. And so this diagram allows you to look at 2 outcomes. So here, 0.98 is basically the relative effect between these 2. And then the relative effect between this one and this one is 1.09. Between this one and this one is 1.12. So it gives you all the information about all the comparisons here. And it's very transparent if you present your data this way. So again, it's one of the results diagram that you expect to see in a network meta-analysis. These are probability best. So if you remember, we talked about ranking earlier, how the treatments are ranked. So in the y-axis for all the plots are the probability of it being best, 0 up to, we've got 0.6 is the highest on this scale. And then this is a ranking. So there are 12 options. So where it is ranked, this is drug. So each drug is on each graph. So here, the probability of it being ranked high is this one, the red line, the red solid line. So there are 2 lines, one for each outcome. The red line is for efficacy, and the dotted line is for acceptability. So you remember, just because you rank first for one outcome doesn't mean you'll always be ranked first for all outcomes. So here you can really see that for metrazapine, it's ranked number 1, the most likely to be ranked first for efficacy. But in terms of acceptability, it's not actually ranked first. So it's really, so this is quite a useful way of looking at the different outcomes and the potential ranking of all your comparators. Now, how do we calculate this probability ranking? So I think it was Ning who asked me yesterday about the relationship between your treatment effects and ranking. So let me try and explain this a little bit. So this is a network meta-analysis comparing placebo with docetaxel, erlotinib, gefapixant, pemetrexed. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 comparison in a network. And so when we're estimating the treatment effect, and this is using the Bayesian Monte Carlo MCMC simulation, we're repeatedly sampling, estimating these treatment effects within the network. So they're not going to be identical because we're sampling within the distribution. And so for every time we run a simulation, it's estimating these estimates simultaneously relating to each other in the network, you can actually apply a ranking for each run. So placebo's rank number 5 is with an odds ratio of 1, and then erlotinib is ranked number 1 based on these estimates across this row, gefapixant number 2, and so on. And then for the next run, we're getting a slightly different ranking, and so on and so on. So we keep running this many, many times, and then what we calculate is an average ranking. The probability of the placebo being ranked 5 out of 1,000 runs, well, how many times did they get ranked number 5? So this is how we calculate the probability ranking. So it's different from the point estimate that you get from your network meta-analysis. Okay, so like pairwise meta-analysis, these diagrams are really complex, and there's a lot of information in meta-analysis that people will need to incorporate. And in this diagram, what the authors try to do is to demonstrate the direct and indirect estimates that they have used within this network. So they use solid lines for head-to-head evidence and dotted line for referring to the loops for indirect evidence to try and help you visualize the relationship. But it gets really complex if your network is quite big. So it's just things that we're beginning to see in network analysis. So incorporating quality of studies. Again, just because you're doing a network meta-analysis doesn't mean you don't do your quality assessment. You still go through the same steps in your systematic review. You read the studies, you extract the data, you critically appraise and assess risk of bias in these studies. So this isn't using the grade approach. And so what this is looking at is the comparisons between alendronate and raloxifene. And we're looking at direct, indirect, and network meta-analysis evidence. So the direct evidence gives you this estimate, the indirect evidence gives you this estimate. You can then build in the quality of evidence that informs this estimate in a table like this. So this direct evidence is based on low quality evidence, this 0.49. The indirect evidence is based on moderate evidence. So the indirect evidence will have brought in additional studies for direct evidence. And then the network meta-analysis, when you bring in direct and indirect evidence, again, is based on moderate level of evidence. So this is one way of bringing into your quality assessment in your presentation of results. And this is another way of looking, of presenting your data based on a traffic light system, which people seem to quite like. And this is looking at the quality of the evidence in each of the comparisons within your network. So this is looking at comparing A and C, C and D, B and D, B and C, and so on. So of the evidence that that's been contributing to this comparison, majority of them are moderate risk of bias, small proportion has low risk, similar with high risk. So again, it's a description of the quality of studies that is contributing to the estimates. This is also a useful way to present your network meta-analysis. It talks about the contribution of direct and indirect evidence within your network. So, so here is the direct comparison in the network where you have head-to-head studies. Here's the network meta-analysis. And basically, the numbers here are the proportion of data that is contributed to this network meta-analysis from the direct and mixed treatment evidence. So these are just lots of different ways of helping you to present a really complex set of data. And these are all great. This was published, I think, 2014. So this is all quite new. And if you're using Stata, go and explore to see what kind of plots they give you. But make sure you understand fully what Stata is doing and how they calculate it. So this is very artistic that I think it could almost go in a gallery. So this is a network, and but this is actually, I find it quite interesting because the red are the studies that are not covered by any systematic reviews. The green are covered by systematic reviews, and then the half box are partially covered with systematic reviews. And then these are the randomized control trials that has been partially covered by systematic reviews. And then you've got treatment comparisons partially covered by systematic reviews. And this is actually quite useful to understand the journey and the totality of the evidence. Has it been evaluated before? What has contributed to this? And this is basically looking at the evidence over time in 2013, 2014, and 2015, how the evidence has evolved within your network. So, you have projects. You can be as creative as you like. There are no rules. So I think somebody should, if you come up with a really beautiful and useful diagram, then you should definitely win a prize for that. Okay, and this paper I think is particularly relevant to you who use Stata. Really good paper talking about the graphical tools that you can use, you can find or generate using Stata in network meta-analysis. So it has lots of really good detail and examples based on this paper. So, like any meta-analysis, there are guidance for network meta-analysis in terms of how to do it well and how to present it well. in meta-analysis, we often talk about PRISMA being the gold standard, and PRISMA now has an extension statement for reporting and incorporating network meta-analysis. So if you're doing a network meta-analysis, make sure that you present it in a way that comply with the PRISMA statement for network meta-analysis. Now, in terms of how the potential guidance to undertaking network meta-analysis, the NICE Decision Support Unit has released a series of working documents, and they are really aiming for the more complex meta-analysis, network meta-analysis. Each of them are like a PhD thesis on its own. So these are huge, huge documents, and they cover really quite complex material. And if I know the authors very well. Excellent reviewers. These people are at the top of the network meta-analysis game, but in all fairness, they're very difficult to read, these documents. They're not very user-friendly. Even for technical analysts, for people like myself who actually do a lot of analysis, some of the material I find it a bit difficult to digest. So these are good sources, but just remember that you need a lot of time to go through. The ISPOR task force has papers on good research practice for indirect treatment comparisons. So there are two papers. One is interpreting indirect treatment comparison and network meta-analysis for decision making, and then the conducting of indirect treatment comparisons and network meta-analysis based on ISPOR task force. And so these are really useful guidance. And so in these guidance, it's very similar to the PRISMA statement. It gives you a checklist. It tells you what they expect you to report in the introduction, methods, and all the individual sections. And here they tell you what they're looking for in the paper. So if you're trying to get your paper published, make sure that you follow these guidance. And actually, when you write your cover letter to submit your paper to the journal editor, tell the editor that you've done this, you've gone through the list, and you have complied with the ISPOR's task force statement. It gives the reviewers confidence. And so these are just continuing on the checklist, on results, and on discussion. Very, very good guidance on how to report network meta-analysis. So this checklist, also from those papers, relates to the search, data collection, statistical plan, data analysis, and reporting. So you will see that these statements and the PRISMA statement are all very similar. Good quality meta-analysis, and the criteria are pretty standard. There's this another paper that actually goes a step further. It relates to the utility of the results of network meta-analysis for decision makers. So it's not just about undertaking and reporting. So if you're faced with a network meta-analysis, it's a credible source of information to inform the decision that you're trying to make. So and it's based on these domains. Is it evidence-based? How have they done the analysis? Do they report on quality and transparency? How do they interpret the results? Are the conclusions balanced and fair? And are there any conflicts of interest? So I think for decision makers who are reading network meta-analysis, this is actually quite a useful tool to assess the evidence that you have in front of you. So I'm going to finish by going through some current opinions on indirect comparison. I think it was really interesting that when we voted earlier, there was a small split between the trust of direct and network evidence. This is what Cochrane says. Cochrane says indirect comparisons are not randomized comparisons and cannot be interpreted as such. They are essentially observational findings across the trials and may suffer the bias of observational studies. Now, I think this is fair enough. And what we're doing in network meta-analysis is we're preserving the randomization within the trials. So, and then we analyze them collectively. but the actual analysis that we're doing are not based on are not based on experimental data. So in a sense, we are doing an observational study, and it may suffer bias from observational studies. And Cochrane also said, in situations where both direct and indirect evidence are available, then unless there are design flaws in head-to-head trials, then the two approaches should always be considered separately, and the direct comparison should take precedence on the basis of forming conclusions. Now, I personally disagree with that. I think that if you fulfill all the underlying assumptions for undertaking mixed treatment comparison or network meta-analysis, then I don't believe that direct evidence necessarily gives you a better, more robust estimate than the network evidence. So that's one view that Cochrane has adopted in 2011. And I don't know if this is going to be updated, because the Cochrane Handbook currently does not have a chapter on network meta-analysis, but the chapter has been written, and I've seen it, and so it's going to be included in the handbook quite imminently. And whether at that stage Cochrane would change their position, I think remains to be seen. What does NICE say? So NICE look at these kind of evidence all the time, especially in new drugs. Companies are only interested in their own drug compared to placebo, majority of the time. But the decision maker wants to know if the new drug works against what we're using now. We do have a drug, it's not placebo, it's something else. So network meta-analysis is evidence that we often see at NICE. So NICE says, data from a series of head-to-head RCTs presented together with a network meta-analysis if appropriate. And when considering evidence from indirect sources only, the appraisal committee would take into account the additional uncertainty associated with the lack of direct evidence, and they're interested in adjusted indirect comparisons and mixed treatment comparison, which I think is a very reasonable approach. As a side comment at NICE, the problem with the network meta-analysis that we see most of the time, if not nearly all the time, is not an analytical approach. We don't normally see problems with the calculations. The problem is the underlying assumption of potential heterogeneity and transitivity. And that's what we spend a lot of the time discussing in these appraisals. In Scotland, the Scottish Medicines Consortium says if no head-to-head evidence are available, then they would consider appropriately conducted indirect comparison. They would accept the Busher method, which is the adjusted indirect comparison, and they would accept mixed treatment comparison or network meta-analysis. The preference is for mixed treatment comparison and network meta-analysis. They consider to be more comprehensive approaches than the Busher method alone. So the Scotland takes a very similar view as England, as NICE in England. In Canada, the CADIF, they say, although there are situations in which indirect treatment comparisons may be performed and can provide useful information, these analyses present with several limitations. Indirect treatment comparisons require inference, extrapolation from known results to situations in which a study has not been done. That is true, and therefore the validity of the estimates obtained may be questionable. And I don't think if one follows the other. So again, it depends on what has been done. In the event that an RCT cannot be conducted, investigators may resort to indirect comparison. So there's a clear preference for direct head-to-head evidence here. Australia, PBAC, strong preference for clinical and economic evaluation based on direct trials, but they recognize that direct trials are not always available. They consider all levels of evidence, but PBAC will be most influenced by the results of direct randomized trials as the most rigorous source of data. And in the absence of direct evidence, alternatives, and they have in the priority of, so they rank this, indirect comparison over non-randomized studies. They'll be considered, and they will be most influenced by direct trials as their most rigorous sources of data. So there is a hierarchy that the Australian HTA prefers. In Germany, EQUIC the methods guy says that network meta-analysis have unsolved methodological problems. Routine application of these methods within the framework of benefit assessment is not advisable. So they're far tougher than the other agencies in terms of accepting these evidence. It should primarily use direct comparative studies. Conclusions for benefit assessments are usually inferred only from the results of direct comparative studies. Economic evaluation of multiple interventions, which is actually quite often the case, the institute can also consider indirect comparison to assess cost-benefit relations, taking into account lower uncertainty of results. So they do recognize that there are situations where you do need indirect comparison and mixed treatment comparison. But so, network meta-analysis is a good methodology that can solve the problem with the lack of evidence. But like any methods and like any studies, there can be methodological problems. And so Fujin Song did a review of some of the published systematic reviews with network meta-analysis some years ago, and showed that the publication of network meta-analysis indirect comparisons has gone up. So this was only down to 2007. If you extend this to today, you can see an exponential growth in the use of this methodology. And the problem in some of the published data was that there is an unclear understanding of underlying assumptions with the authors who use those methods. So they don't justify why they have chosen a certain approach, or they have chosen the wrong approach and they haven't realized it. There's incomplete search and inclusion of relevant studies. So this is not a feature of network meta-analysis. You can have this with pairwise meta-analysis as well, but it's the same problem potentially. Use of flawed or inappropriate methods, again, is not specific to network meta-analysis. Lack of objective and validated methods to assess or improve trial similarity. So transitivity is a big issue. Inadequate comparison and inappropriate combination of direct and indirect evidence. So these are the key limitations that he has observed in the published literature. And then more recently in 2017, there was a study, again, surveying published network meta-analysis based on these 6 criteria, whether consistency was assessed, whether the direct and indirect evidence was combined appropriately, whether they accounted for inconsistency, was there rationale for fixed or random effects model, was heterogeneity assumption explored, and did they account for it? And you can see that the yes is actually quite low. So there are poor quality network meta-analysis out there as well. And so perhaps it's not surprising that a lot of our HTA agencies are suspicious of the analysis. But it's not because it's a network meta-analysis, it's how it was conducted. So you need to make sure that when you do your analysis that you're going to get 100% green on all these criteria. So some thoughts towards the end. A single source of evidence are rarely sufficient. I don't think we can ever answer a decision question based on one study. Pairwise meta-analysis is useful, straightforward to implement, but it has limitations, and we've talked about that last week. And it's the same for network meta-analysis. It's an extension to pairwise meta-analysis, potentially more sophisticated analysis, more complex analysis has limitations. And there's a trade-off between the methodological limitations and decision making. So do you accept the limitations that you have in your analysis, or do you reject the limitations and not make a decision? Reimbursement decisions are not determined by the inclusion or exclusion of network meta-analysis alone, as we can see. It's about the quality of these network meta-analysis. And it could be, we know that most of the time it's about the price, it's about the evidence they present us, it's how they estimate the treatment effect, whether they included all studies or not, how they estimate costs. So I think it's not fair to say that network meta-analysis is the only criteria or an essential criteria in reimbursement decisions. In the absence of direct evidence, you need to establish appropriate comparators. So this is what most submissions fail on when they have a network meta-analysis, is what comparators they use and how wide they go with their network. You need a comprehensive search for appropriate data. You need to consider heterogeneity and the choice of the methodological approach in context. You need to explore heterogeneity, transitivity, and consistency. And transparency in reporting is a key. You always have limitations. Instead of trying to brush it under the carpet, the way to deal with it is to just declare it. And it's up to somebody else to reanalyze your data a different way and challenge you. So transparency is a key here for all evidence synthesis. So the recommendation is explicit discussion of underlying assumptions while you're thinking about your research question, not at the end when you have run your analysis, then try and go back and justify your underlying assumptions. A systematic literature search to make sure that you don't have selection bias in your data. You have been as inclusive as possible. Include evidence from head-to-head studies. Avoid naive and indirect comparison. Don't just take treatment estimate from one study compared to another and make a naive comparison. Data from multiple arms trials should be appropriately analyzed, and avoid using the same control group twice. So sorry, this is not worded very well. So it is possible to have 3-arm trial in your network meta-analysis. So we haven't really talked about that, and that you can adjust for that. So we keep talking about 2-arm trials, bringing in the same comparisons and different comparators together. But you can bring in 3-arm trial, but you need to analyze it appropriately. And it's not right to use, if you have a 3-arm trial, it's not right to use the same comparator. So if you have A, B, and placebo, you don't compare A with placebo and then B with placebo again. So you're using the same arm twice. So that's not really the best way to analyze it. Heterogeneity can be explored using subgroup analysis, meta-regression, or expert subjective opinion to try and give you some clinical underlying reasoning or hypothesis for exploring these analyses. And direct and indirect evidence should be explicitly compared to look for consistency. So that's just really important as well. Right, so I think this is the end. Some of you are looking a bit stunned. I hope that's useful, because I always think if you understand the underlying assumptions and principles really well, then if you come across a more complex analysis, it's easy for you to try and understand what they've done. It's building on the groundwork, like the way network meta-analysis is built on pairwise meta-analysis. And they are very similar. So you need to have have all the relevant evidence in your analysis. You always have the problem of potential heterogeneity. And in network meta-analysis, the added challenge is the consistency between the direct and indirect evidence when you have a loop within your network meta-analysis. So very similar steps between pairwise and network meta-analysis. So what I'll do is I'll give you time to digest this overnight. And so tomorrow we're going to do the critical appraisal. If you have any questions relating to what we've talked about today, then I'm more than happy to answer them. So please do spend time to read that paper. It's quite a complicated paper if you're not familiar with network meta-analysis, and it will be good if we can have good discussions tomorrow. Thank you.